بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم قال الله عز وجل بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على محمد عبدك ورسولك وصل على المؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات وبارك على محمد وأزواجه وذريته. Respected brothers and sisters, in the previous session we started the discussion on migration and al-hijrah. We explored the meaning of the word hijrah, the linguistic and technical understanding of the word hijrah, and we also explored a few themes and a few subjects and topics surrounding this discussion and this topic of al-hijrah. Today, inshallah, we're going to be covering stories of the first migrants and also the first imam in Madinah Munawwara after the hijrah, and a few more details about the hijrah story. And next week, inshallah, we'll be starting from the story of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's migration, his own migration journey with Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiyallahu anhu. But before we speak about the first migrants, I want all of us to put this migration into perspective. What does this migration actually mean? We hear the term migration quite frequently. Many of us sitting in this room today and many of our listeners online are also migrants. They may have migrated from a different country or a different state or a different continent, city, and some may have arrived at these shores for economic reasons, for economic prosperity. Some may have been fleeing wars in their homelands, and many people come to this country for different reasons, and everyone's migration journey is a special story for themselves, and it has some significance and some background attached to it. So when we understand the story of migration that occurred in the life of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam from that perspective, that this is a significant journey for those who are undertaking the journey, it puts many things into perspective for us. So let's think about this hijrah for a moment. This migration was not just a migration, it was in actuality escaping from a hostile land, from a troubled place, from a place of tyranny and oppression. It wasn't just a case of an individual seeking new pastures or greener pastures elsewhere. It was a group of Muslims that were downtrodden, that were oppressed, and they needed to escape the situation of oppression and seek peace elsewhere. So this was a migration about saving their own lives. It wasn't just a migration for the sake of migrating. This was about saving their lives, protecting their families, and protecting their religion and their honor. It wasn't a migration for economic reasons or any other worldly gain. And let's think about it for a moment. They were going on a path that was unclear, it was hidden, and it was also uncertain. They didn't know what they were going to find on the other side. They didn't know what was going to happen on the journey. It was very possible that they may be found out, they may be captured, that the Quraysh would pose a threat on the journey itself, or worse, they could be killed. These were all possibilities. We might see hostility around us sometimes today as well. Many of us have heard from hostile individuals when they say things such as "go back home," right? Has anybody heard that one before? Go home, go back home, right? Like, for those who are born and raised in these countries, for example, the UK or the USA, like when somebody says to you, go back home, what does that actually mean, right? So, like growing up, we used to face a lot of that type of racism in England. This was pre 9/11 as well, right? So we'd be playing football outside and people would just roll their windows down and shout the P word, which is equivalent to the N word here, right, in the UK. And say, go home, go back home. These things we would hear again and again, right? So we hear these types of statements from people about going home, telling us to leave. And I'm sure that if Muslims were to migrate en masse from these lands, quite a few people would be happy about it. Little realizing that Muslims are part of the society and indigenous to these lands as well. And there's a lot of history behind that. And this is not the scope of today's lesson, but if you want to learn more, there's a lot regarding the African history in the United States of America and Muslims being a very important part of that story. So, of course, we might hear these types of statements and these types of comments from people, go home, go back where you came from, so on and so forth. And if we were to migrate from our home, which is, Catonsville, Baltimore, or whether you were living in London or wherever you were, and that was your home, you were born there, raised there, if you were to migrate from those lands, nobody would stop you. People would let you go. Now, it was different for the Meccans. The Meccans were not just free to leave. They had to escape. Because the Quraysh, their own tribe, and their own families posed a threat. They didn't want them to leave easily. So they posed a threat and they also created many obstacles and barriers for them to leave. And that is why the earlier migrants, they had to leave empty-handed, without anything. They left their lands, they left their homes, they left their businesses, and they traveled with the bare minimum to make their path and their journey easier for them. The lesser the burden and lesser the load, the better for them. And that's what you're going to see in the story of this migration. There were companions like Abdurrahman bin Auf, radiallahu anhu, who was extremely wealthy in Mecca. And he migrated to Medina, leaving everything behind in Mecca Mukarramah. So starting completely new, pressing the reset button. This is what this migration was about. And that is why the earlier migrants have a special rank with Allah. Allah says in Surah Al-Baqarah, وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَنْ يَشْرِي نَفْسَهُ ابْتِغَاءَ مَرْضَاتِ اللَّهِ وَاللَّهُ رَؤُوفٌ بِالْعِبَادِ. And from the people are some who sell their souls seeking the pleasure of Allah. And Allah is compassionate with His servants. So this is the nature of this migration, escaping from their homeland. That's all they knew. They knew nothing else. Leaving their families, their tribes, their kin. Leaving their homes, their businesses, their lands, their goods, their assets, everything behind. And starting fresh, not knowing what this journey will take, where it will take them, who they'll encounter on the way, what it will be like. So let's put this into perspective and think about this when we have this discussion. Now, in this light, we want to discuss some of the first migrants. So there's one statement, there's a hadith actually of Imam al-Bukhari rahmatullahi alayh, on the authority of Bara ibn Azib radiallahu anhu. He says that the first to arrive in Medina from the companions of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam were Mus'ab bin Umair and Abdullah bin Maktoum radiallahu anhu. Both came to teach us the Quran. Then came Ammar bin Yasir, Bilal, and Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas. And then came Umar radiallahu anhu with about 20 people. So this is one narration. Now, of course, what we understand here is that Mus'ab and Abdullah bin Maktoum radiallahu anhuma were both sent by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to teach Quran before the migration happened. So from that angle, you can say that they are the first migrants because they are Meccan. They're people from Mecca and they're migrating to Medina Munawwara after the Bay'a Aqaba Athaniya, the second pledge of allegiance that the Medinan companions took. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam sent these two companions back with them to teach them Islam. So we understand that. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam sending these companions. However, for those who actually migrated, escaping persecution, the first of those were the family of Abu Salama radiallahu anhu. So if we want to say that the first migrants from Mecca to Medina were Mus'ab and Abdullah ibn Maktoum, that is also correct, but it's from a different angle and perspective. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam sent them to teach after the bay'ah and the pledge of allegiance that the Medinan companions took, the stories that we've studied so far. However, this family of Abu Salama, and Abu Salama was the foster brother of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Abu Salama's family had initially migrated to Ethiopia. And then they heard that some people have become Muslim in Medina. So they returned to Mecca for a while, and when they had returned to Mecca, which was their homeland, they were tortured again and they were troubled by their own family members. So they decided to migrate now to Medina Munawwara. So the story of their migration is a very interesting one because it wasn't very easy. It was a very, very difficult migration. So Muhammad bin Ishaq says, after the termination of Bay'atul Aqaba, when the pledge that the Medinan companions took, after that had ended, Rasulullah had commanded the Sahaba, the companions, to migrate to Medina Munawwara. So the permission to migrate had started. This was a moment that Rasulullah was made aware of through divine commandment by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The first person to migrate was Abu Salama with his family. Now, Abu Salama was from Banu Asad, the family of Asad, which was a tribe of the Quraysh. And it was actually a branch of Banu Makhzum, which was the tribe of Abu Jahl, right? So this is one of the branches of Quraysh. But this migration of this was a very difficult journey. So Abu Salama, together with his wife Salama, and later on Salama marries Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam after Abu Salama passes away. Salama marries Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam later on. But at this time she is the wife of Abu Salama. Abu Salama, Salama, and their child Salama, the child's name is Salama, they are migrating. What happens? The family of Salama comes, Banu Mughira, and they say, if you want to go, you are free to go wherever you want, but you are not taking our daughter with you. She belongs to us. And they grabbed her and they separated her from her husband. The family of Abu Salama arrives and they say that this son, Salama, belongs to our tribe. He is the child of the tribe. You cannot take him away to Mecca with you. So what happens? The child is separated from the mother and the father. So all three are separated at this point. Salama is taken by her family. Banu Asad takes the child. And Abu Salama, he's left alone. Abu Salama, in this condition and state, is forced to migrate. So he's separated from his family. He migrates. Salama radiallahu anha says that for a year, every day, I would go to an area called Abtah and I would cry and I would weep. I was in such pain at the separation from my husband, separation from my child. And you can imagine, of course, the pain of a wife, the pain of a mother. Finally, one of her clansmen, one of her relatives overheard, or he felt pity on her. And he rebuked his community, his family, and said to them that how can you separate somebody from their child and separate them from their husband, leave her be. Let her go. Let her do what she needs to do. They reunited her with her son. Then she decides to travel to Medina. She's traveling on her own, and she arrives at an area called Tan'im. Tan'im is where today Masjid Aisha is located. So it's about 45 minutes or an hour from Mecca. And when she arrives in Tan'im, she meets Uthman bin Talha. Now Uthman bin Talha at this time was not a Muslim. But Uthman bin Talha asked her, "Where are you going? And who are you with?" She says, "I have nobody but my Lord and this child of mine." At this moment, something shook him inside. And even though he wasn't a Muslim at this point, he became a Muslim about 7 to 8 years later. He decided to help her. He said that I will take you to Medina and reunite you with your husband. She says that he was such a noble man with such great qualities and such an honorable person that he would hold the reins of the camel. If we needed to rest, he would allow us to come off, dismount the camel. He would move to the side. Then he would take the camel, tie the camel to a tree, rest under its shade. When it was time to depart again, he would bring the camel. He would make the camel halt and sit down, and he would allow us to get onto the camel, and then he would take us, and he would never look around. He was a very honorable person. I've never met a man more honorable than Uthman bin Talha. Then finally she was reunited with her husband, Abu Salama, in an area called Quba. We all know Quba is a very famous town on the outskirts of Madinah Munawwara. So this is the story of her migration. When they reached Quba, he said, "Your husband resides in this village. Enter this village with the barakah of Allah." So she says this was a very important meeting that I had with this individual, Uthman bin Talha, and he was able to deliver me and take me to my husband. He was very chivalrous and he was very respectful, and he wasn't a Muslim at the time. He didn't take any compensation for it, any fee or anything of that nature. Now, who were some of the other earlier migrants? One of the other earlier migrants was Amir bin Rabi'ah. He was another companion from Mecca. He migrated with his wife, Layla bint Khaythama, and she was nursing at the time. So you can imagine migrating with a child, escaping for your life. That is another serious undertaking, right? It's a serious struggle. Then there was the family of Jahsh, Abu Ahmad bin Jahsh, Abdullah bin Jahsh, and this family that migrates. Then when all of this is happening, some of the Meccan individuals like Abu Jahl and Utbah, they're seeing these situations and they're talking about how some of the houses of Mecca are becoming empty, and they're singing couplets and poems about it. And they start to complain. And Abu Jahl goes up to the uncle of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Abbas, and starts to complain more. Says, "Your nephew Muhammad has separated us. He has caused this in this town." And this is very typical behavior of oppressors, gaslighting. The blame is on them, yet they are shifting the blame upon Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Then what happens? So I'm going to name some of the other earlier companions. There was Ukasha bin Mihsan, Uqba ibn Wahab, Amr bin Mihsan, Tamam bin Ubaidah, Muhammad bin Jahsh. Then some of the females that migrated, the earlier migrants. There was Zainab bint Jahash, Habiba bint Jahash, Hamna bint Jahash. So they're all one family, right? Judhama bin Jandal, Qais bint Mihsan, Habib bint Thumama, Amina bint Ruqaysh, Sanjara bint Tamim. These were brave individuals, and they also migrated, some of the earlier migrants. They were followed by Umar radiallahu anhu and Ayash bin Rabi'ah. Now Ayash ibn Abi Rabi'ah, actually. And the story of Umar radiallahu anhu's migration is also an interesting one. Umar radiallahu anhu's story, you might have heard some narrations saying that Umar radiallahu anhu, when he wanted to migrate, he was brave and bold, and he went to the Kaaba and he announced that I am going to migrate. If anybody wants to, stop me, try to stop me. But if you try to stop me, then your mother will be praying over you. She will be mourning over you because, I'll take you out, and so on and so forth. These are some of the legends that we hear. However, that's a weak narration. That's a weak narration. We have to remember this was a very hostile area and town. And for one man to take on the entire Quraysh and the people of Mecca is not possible. So for him to go to the Mecca so boldly and to claim and announce that I'm going to migrate, if anybody has the strength to stop me, then come in my way, that doesn't make a lot of sense as well. So let's put things into perspective. Umar radiallahu anhu was migrating with Ayash ibn Abi Rabi'ah, and they were waiting for an individual named Hisham bin As. Now Umar radiallahu anhu, they decided that we will wait at an area called Banu Ghiffar, the area of Banu Ghiffar, which was about 10 miles from Mecca. And whoever makes it there the next morning, we will assume that they are coming with us. And whoever does not make it there, we will assume that they were unable to reach us and they were stopped on their way. So the next morning, an individual by the name of Hisham bin As, who was supposed to join them, he had not arrived. So it was assumed that this individual was probably stopped in his tracks. So they continued going. They migrated. Umar radiallahu anhu migrated. Now, another narration to support the idea that Umar radiallahu anhu was not so bold in this situation and that he had to also escape is another story narrated by his own son, Ibn Umar radiallahu anhuma, in Bukhari. He says that my father was in the house. One of the Quraysh by the name of Utbah, he was one of the leader of the Quraysh, he came in and said to my father Umar, what is wrong, Umar? Why do you not leave the house? He said, I don't leave the house because I have accepted Islam and my people want to kill me. So Utbah said, I will grant you protection. And Utbah left the house and said to the people, why are you here? And the people said that Umar has left the religion of his forefathers. And he says, very well, but I am going to grant him protection. And of course, in that time, in that day and age, in that society, if somebody had extended amnesty or safety or protection to an individual, that individual was granted protection. They were untouchable. You could not do anything to that individual. For if you did, then you would owe ransom and blood money to the person who granted them protection. So these were some of the laws at the time that people used to follow. So what happens is Umar radiallahu anhu migrates with this individual Ayash ibn Abi Rabi'ah and about 20 other individuals. When they arrive in Medina, Abu Jahl also comes to Medina. And he comes to Medina and he says to the Ayash bin Abi Rabi'ah that your mother is in depression after you left. Your mother has taken a vow that she will never comb her hair and she will until you come home, meaning that she's going to give up on life until she sees you. So of course, being a good son of his mother, his emotions are being stirred by Abu Jahl. Umar radiallahu anhu tries to stop him and says to him, don't fall for this trick. These are treacherous people and they are playing with your emotions. Don't leave. For if there are lice in your mother's hair, she will comb them out. And that's the truth. She's not going to give up on her life. But of course, the emotions inside him were stirring. And he said, no, I have to go and see my mother. I have to go and visit my mother. He insisted. Umar radiallahu anhu persuaded him, or you could say dissuaded him from going, but he insisted that he will go. Umar radiallahu anhu said, okay, take this animal of mine, because this animal is quick, it's agile. If there is any treachery on the way there, escape and come back fast. So he's traveling back to Mecca now with Abu Jahl. And Abu Jahl is a sharp cookie, he's sharp. So Abu Jahl says, let me ride your animal for a bit. For my animal is hefty, it can't carry my load or burden, let's take turns. So the minute that they came out, dismounted the animal, Abu Jahl tied his hands together with a companion of his. and they dragged him back to Mecca. So the plan all along was to drag him back to Mecca. So Ayyash bin Abi Rabi'a arrives in Mecca with Abu Jahl, with his hands tied behind his back. And Abu Jahl announces to everybody, this is how you should treat your fools, just like I am treating this fool here. He was a very arrogant man, Abu Jahl. And they, of course, imprisoned him. They kept him hostage and captive. And he was released a couple of years later. But Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam heard about it, of course, and he would make dua for him in qunut, in salah. He would make dua for him specifically. Oh Allah, help him. Oh Allah, rescue him and release him. Oh Allah. So Umar radiallahu anhu migrates, and he migrates with a group of people. Amongst the people that joined Umar radiallahu anhu on the journey was Zayd bin Khattab, who was his own brother. Umar bin Khattab's own brother, Zayd bin Khattab. Now Zayd bin Khattab radiallahu anhu, the brother of Umar radiallahu anhu, he became Muslim before Umar radiallahu anhu. And he also passed away, he was actually martyred in the Battle of Yamama. Remember we spoke about Battle of Yamama briefly last week in the era of Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu. So Umar radiallahu anhu he was very upset when he passed away. And he used to say that my brother Zayd, he beat me to Islam and he beat me to martyrdom as well. My brother Zayd beat me to Islam and he also beat me to martyrdom. So he was, that was one person. Then there was Amr and Abdullah, the sons of Suraqa. Who is Suraqa? When we study the story further, we're going to see Suraqa is one of the people that tried to stop the Prophet from migrating. He actually almost caught the Prophet ﷺ. Suraqa bin Malik bin Ju'shum. Then there was Khunais bin Hudhafa as-Sahmi, Sa'id bin Amr bin Nufail, who was the brother-in-law of Umar radiallahu anhu, and then Khawla bint Khawla, a female that was also in the group. And some others that followed were Talha bin Ubaidullah. So now most of the companions are leaving, they're going. Suhaib bin Sinan, Hamza bin Abdul Muttalib, these are all very famous companions. Zayd bin Haritha, Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Harith, he's from the family of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam from Banu Hashim. Then Hussein bin Harith, right, that was one of his brothers. Then Mistah ibn Abi Uthatha, who is the nephew of Abu Bakr Siddiq. Khabbab ibn al-Arad, Abdurrahman bin Auf, Zubair bin Awam, who is married to Asma, the daughter of Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu. Then there was Uthman bin Affan radiallahu anhu, and Salim, the emancipated slave of Abu Hudhayfa. Now remember this name, Salim, because we're going to speak about him in a few minutes. So in short, almost everybody had migrated. Who's left behind? Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu, Ali radiallahu anhu, and a few of the companions that were weak, who never had the ability to leave, some that may have been handicapped, some that may have been imprisoned. Those were the few companions that were left behind in Medina, in Makkah Mukarramah. Now, who is the first Imam in Quba? Quba is a town before Medina. Before you arrive in Medina, you pass the town of Quba. So when the migrants had migrated to Medina, some of them stopped at an area called Quba. And the first person to lead the salah there, who was the Imam in Quba, was Salim, the emancipated slave of Abu Hudhayfa. Now, it's interesting because the emancipated slaves played a very significant role. They learned, they studied, they acquired a lot of knowledge, and they had leading positions. So Salim was one of those. And Salim was originally from Persia, from southeast Iran, or southwest Iran, if I remember. From an area called Istakhar, is a city. So he was the first person to lead in a place near Quba called Usbah. Right, so this was the area where he led the prayer. And this is narrated by Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhuma in Sahih al-Bukhari. And he also mentions the reason. Why did Salim lead the prayer? Why was he the first Imam? Because he knew the most Quran. Salim led the prayer because he knew the most Quran. Right? And this is why, the statement of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Allah raises people through the Quran and Allah lowers some people through the Quran. What does that mean? Allah raises some people like Salim. Before Islam, he was a slave. After Islam, he was freed. And Allah elevated him. Right? The Quran elevated him. And some people are lowered through the Quran because they reject it. They turn away from it. Doesn't matter how high they are in worldly status, they are lowered eventually. Right? So this is what happens to some people. Now, we move on. We're going to wait. This is the last discussion, inshallah. At this point, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam has not yet migrated. And he is in Makkah Mukarramah with Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. He's waiting for Allah to give him instructions. Now, we're talking about 2 or 3 months after the bay'ah happens. Most of the people have migrated. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is still left behind. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu keeps asking the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam for permission to migrate. When is our turn? When are we going to migrate? When can I migrate? Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam says to him, don't be hasty. Don't be hasty. Perhaps Allah will give you a good companion. Right? So Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu used to have a desire that perhaps that companion will be Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We're going to speak about this inshallah later on in next week's lesson or the week after. That Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu had the honor and the virtue of being selected by Allah to be the companion of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in this journey, which was one of the most momentous journeys of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's life. That is a divine selection. And that is why Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu used to say to Abu Bakr that I will give you all of my rewards if you give me the reward for spending one night in the cave with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam during migration. One night. Just the reward of one night. So that was a very special status that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu enjoyed. Imam Bukhari rahmatullahi alayhi narrates from Aisha radiallahu anha in a lengthy hadith, and we're going to study that hadith inshallah, that whoever had already migrated had migrated, and even those that had migrated earlier on to Ethiopia had also migrated to Medina. Most of them, some stayed behind in Ethiopia. My father Abu Bakr was getting prepared for the journey. And he would say to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when are we going to leave? And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would say to him, hold your horses, right? Be composed. Wait, ala rislik. I hope that Allah will grant me permission. Oh Rasulullah, Allah will grant you permission. Yes, Allah will grant me permission. And he also kept 2 animals in this anticipation. And he would feed the animals daily, preparing them for this journey. So this is where we're going to end inshallah. Next week we'll speak about the beginnings of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's migration. It starts with the consultation of the Quraysh in Darun Nadwa when they plot to kill Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam before he can migrate. Allah begins a discussion in Surah Al-Anfal. Remember when they plotted to imprison you or kill you or exile you, and they plot and Allah plans, and Allah is the best of planners. So that verse is a reference to this story, right? So this story, inshallah, we're going to speak about next week. Subhanallah bihamdihi, subhanakallahumma bihamdik, wa nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun, wa salamun ala al-mursalin, walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin, bi rahmatika ya arhamar rahimin.